January 18th, 1945. The Philippine jungle. What do you do when you are an American soldier alone in enemy territory and 12 Japanese women are begging you to kill them? Private James Morrison from Fort Worth, Texas had 30 seconds to make a choice that would echo across 70 years and 4 generations. They called him Buck back home. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from 3 days of malaria fever that made his bones feel like they were vibrating apart from the inside out. This is the story of how one Hershey's chocolate bar changed the destiny of 58 lives. The smell hit first. Wet earth and rotting orchids, a sweet, sour stench that coated the back of the throat like motor oil. Buck sat on a moss-covered boulder outside the limestone cave, his M1 Garand resting across his knees. The metal was slick with condensation. Every surface in this godforsaken jungle wept moisture. His uniform clung to his skin like a second layer of wet canvas. The fabric had gone stiff with dried sweat and the residue of fever that had spiked and broken twice in the past 72 hours. Behind him, huddled in the jagged mouth of the cave, 12 pairs of eyes watched him with a terror so profound it transcended language. These were not soldiers, not in any sense Buck understood from his training at Fort Benning. They wore tattered remnants of Japanese auxiliary uniforms, thin cotton, that hung off starved frames like funeral shrouds. Mud-caked, blood-stained, the fabric torn in places that suggested violence or desperate flight through the thick undergrowth. The youngest one, a girl who could not have been more than 17, held a shard of broken glass against her own throat. Her name was Yuki. Buck did not know that yet. All he knew was that her knuckles had gone white from gripping the glass. Her skin was the color of parched parchment. She whispered the same word over and over. Onegai, onegai, please, please. But she was not begging for mercy. She was begging for death. Buck looked away. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. The propaganda had been thorough. He had been told the Japanese were fanatics, demons who would never surrender. But sitting there in that clearing, with the morning light filtering through the mahogany leaves and shafts of bruised purple and gold, all Buck saw were terrified children waiting for the blow to fall. Why would a 17-year-old girl beg an American soldier for death instead of mercy? The answer would shake everything Buck Morrison thought he knew about war duty and what it meant to be human. But before Buck could make that choice, he had to understand why these women wanted to die, and to understand that we need to go back. Not far, just 3 days, to the moment when a radio transmission changed the course of 13 lives forever. Buck had been separated from his unit during the chaotic push through the Shimbu Line. The 158th Infantry, they called themselves the Bushmasters. Good men, farm boys like Buck City boys from Chicago and New York, all mixed together in the great American melting pot of war. They had been advancing through a series of ridges where the Japanese 14th Area Army had dug in like ticks. The jungle there was a living thing, hostile. The canopy was so thick that sunlight barely penetrated. Everything grew on top of everything else. Vines thick as a man's arm strangled trees that had been standing for centuries. The ground was a soup of mud and rotting vegetation. Every step was a battle against the earth itself, trying to suck your boots off your feet. The firefight had come out of nowhere. That was how it always happened in jungle warfare. No front lines, no clear enemy positions, just sudden violence erupting from the green wall. Buck had been separated when a mortar round hit close enough to throw him 15 feet into a ravine. When he climbed out, ears ringing, uniform shredded, his squad was gone. The radio crackled to life, maybe an hour later. The transmission was garbled, heavy canopy interference. A brewing storm somewhere to the east adding static to every word. But the message was clear enough. Hold position, guard cargo, transport inbound 48 hours. That was 72 hours ago. Buck had found the limestone cave on the second day. High ground, good visibility of the approaches, a source of fresh water trickling down the rock face. He had set up a defensive position and waited. The cargo he assumed would be supplies, ammunition, maybe medical equipment. The Army did not usually tell a private the details. He had not expected 12 Japanese women, and he certainly had not expected them to be more terrified of him than he was of them. In the next hour, you will discover why the Japanese military ordered these 12 women executed. You will learn about the single act of kindness that shattered 70 years of propaganda. You will see how Buck's choice created a family spanning 4 generations across 2 countries. And you will witness the reunion in 2015 that brought 70 descendants together to honor one chocolate bar. If you or someone you know served in the Pacific Theater during World War II, this story will hit close to home. Drop a comment and let us know your connection to this era. We read every single one. Now let us go back to where it all started. Fort Worth, Texas, 1943. James Morrison was not supposed to be a soldier. He was supposed to be a rancher. The Morrison family had worked the same patch of land outside Fort Worth for 3 generations. Red dirt country, hard country. The kind of place that taught you early that life was not fair, but it could be good if you worked hard enough and kept your word. Buck was the oldest of 5 children. His father had been killed in a border raid in 1938. Mexican bandits, his mother had died giving birth to the youngest sister. That left Buck at 19 years old responsible for 4 younger sisters and a ranch that was barely holding on during the Depression. He learned to be both father and brother. He learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed. He learned to fix a fence with nothing but baling wire and stubbornness. And he learned the 3 rules his daddy had taught him before dying. Protect the weak. Keep your word. Never waste food. Every Sunday before the war, Buck would smoke Lucky Strikes on the ranch porch after church. He would watch the Texas sunset turn the sky colors of burnt orange and blood. The smell of his youngest sister's pecan pie would drift through the open kitchen window. She had learned their mother's recipe by heart. The sound of cattle lowing in the distance. The creak of the windmill turning in the evening breeze. That was the America Buck was fighting for. December 7th, 1941 changed everything. Pearl Harbor. Buck heard the news on the radio while fixing a water pump in the North Pasture. He walked back to the house, cleaned up, put on his only suit, drove into Fort Worth the next morning and enlisted. His sisters cried. The youngest, Rachel, was only 12. She grabbed onto his arm and would not let go. But Buck knew someone had to protect families like his. Someone had to stand between the innocent and the monsters. That was what his daddy would have done. The Army sent him to Fort Benning for basic training, then to California for jungle warfare preparation, then across the Pacific on a transport ship so crowded you could not lie down without touching 3 other men. The smell of diesel fuel and vomit, the constant roll of the ocean, and finally the Philippines. Liberation, they called it. General Douglas MacArthur was keeping his promise to return. But for Buck Morrison, the war had shrunk to the size of this clearing. He was alone. His squad was gone. The transport was 3 days overdue. And sitting in that cave were 12 human beings who believed he was a demon sent to torture them before death. The propaganda, he would learn, had been thorough. The Japanese women had been told since childhood that Americans were kiku, blue-eyed devils who would feast on their flesh, who would subject them to horrors that made death seem like a mercy. Every fear had been carefully planted and watered until it grew into something monstrous in their minds. But Buck did not know that yet. All he knew was that his orders said guard the cargo. And the cargo was looking at him like he was death itself. Now we need to understand who these women were. Not all 12, that would take hours, but 3 of them. 3 women whose lives would become so intertwined with Buck's that 70 years later, their grandchildren would still tell the story. Emiko Sato was 35 years old. Before the war, she had been an elementary school English teacher in Kyoto. She had a son named Kenji, who was 8 years old. Her husband had been killed at Iwo Jima. She had received the notification 6 months earlier, a single sheet of paper informing her that her husband had died with honor for the emperor. Emiko was educated. She spoke English better than most Japanese civilians. But she hid this fact from the others initially. Knowledge could be dangerous. In the world she had been forced into, showing intelligence could mark you as a troublemaker. She carried herself with what Buck would later describe as brittle, desperate dignity, like a china doll that had been glued back together too many times. One more shock and she would shatter completely. But until then, she would hold herself together through sheer force of will. The propaganda had sunk its claws deep into Emiko's mind. They told us Americans eat Japanese children, she would later say. Cook them alive. I believed because I had to. Not believing meant I had already lost my mind. Then there was Yuki Nakamura, 17 years old. She had been promised in marriage to a merchant's son. The wedding was planned for August 1945. She had never left her village before the conscription. Her hands were bird-bone delicate, meant for tea ceremony, not war. The broken glass in her palm cut deep, blood mixed with mud, but she did not feel it. Death seemed kinder than dishonor. Yuki represented everything innocent and fragile about the women in that cave. She still tried to fix her hair with a broken piece of mirror, clinging to femininity even as the world around her had descended into barbarism. She had not yet learned that survival sometimes meant letting go of everything you thought made you human. The third woman was Haruka Tanaka, 28 years old. She had been a medical orderly at the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital. She had lost her younger sister in the firebombing. American bombs. The memory of pulling her sister's body from the rubble was still fresh, raw, a wound that would never heal. Haruka had training. She recognized the symptoms of malaria in Buck's trembling hands and fever-bright eyes. Her professional instincts warred with her grief. Part of her wanted to help. The healer in her could not watch suffering without responding. But the sister in her remembered American bombs turning her world into an inferno. She was quiet, observant. Her hands were always moving. A nurse's habit. Even now, covered in mud and blood, she could not stop cataloging injuries. Who needed treatment first? What supplies would be required? It was the only way she knew to keep her mind from shattering. The other 9 women had their own stories. Aiko, the farmer's daughter, with the loud laugh that somehow survived even in this hell. Setsuko, who was 8 weeks pregnant and hiding it because pregnancy in a combat zone was a death sentence. The twins Fumiko and Chayo factory workers from Tokyo, who had never been separated until the war. Each woman carried her own weight of fear and loss and desperate hope for survival. But to understand why they were in that cave, we need to go back 6 months, to July 1944, to a conscription that promised honor and delivered something else entirely. The 12 women had been selected for what was described as a medical auxiliary unit. The notice came on official Imperial Army letterhead. Your country needs you. Serve the Emperor with honor. Save the lives of wounded soldiers. It sounded noble, patriotic. How could anyone refuse? They were transported north to Manchuria, to a facility that bore the designation Unit 731. The name meant nothing to most of them. Emiko had heard rumors, whispers, but rumors were dangerous things to repeat. When they arrived, the reality became clear with brutal efficiency. They were not given nurse uniforms. They were given silk robes, makeup, the kind of clothing that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a different kind of service. Emiko would later describe that moment as the death of innocence. When we arrived, she said they did not give us bandages or surgical instruments. They gave us perfume and lipstick. We understood then what kind of medical service they wanted. The women faced a choice, comply or refuse. 12 women from different backgrounds, different cities, different lives, all made the same decision in that moment. They said no. The officer in charge was furious. Refusal was insubordination. Dishonor to the emperor. In a military culture built on absolute obedience, saying no was not just rebellion. It was a kind of treason. They were stamped with a designation that would follow them like a curse. Rejected for service, insubordinate, and in the chaos of a war that Japan was clearly losing, insubordinate women who knew too much about classified facilities were a liability. The disposal order came down in January. Simple, efficient, bureaucratic. The women were to be transported to the Philippine front, placed in a remote location, and executed at 0600 hours on January 18, 1945. The officer assigned to carry out the execution was Captain Takeishi Sato. He was 32 years old. He had joined the Imperial Army at 18. He was a true believer in Bushido, in the code of honor that said death was preferable to surrender or shame. But Captain Takeishi Sato had a problem. The woman marked as number 1 on the disposal list, Emiko Sato, was his older sister. The moment Buck Morrison discovered this fact, everything changed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because at precisely 0100 hours on January 18th, 3 hours after the scheduled execution time, Buck was about to find 12 women who should have been dead. He had heard sounds coming from the cave earlier that morning, movement, whispers. He had approached cautiously, rifle ready, expecting anything from Japanese soldiers to wild animals. What he found instead made him lower his weapon in confusion. 12 women, huddled together, filthy, terrified. When they saw him, Emiko crawled forward. Her English was broken but understandable. "Please," she said. "Quick. No pain." Buck stared. His mind could not process what he was seeing. "Ma'am," he said, "I am not here to hurt you. I am here to—" He did not finish the sentence because Yuki screamed, a sound of pure animal terror. She raised the glass shard to her own throat. Her hand was shaking so badly, the glass was cutting her palm. Blood ran down her wrist. Buck froze. Every instinct told him to back away, give them space. But something in Yuki's eyes stopped him. It was not hatred he saw there. It was not even fear of him specifically. It was a deeper, older terror. The kind that comes from being told your entire life that the world is full of monsters, and now one of those monsters is standing in front of you. He slowly reached into his rucksack. 12 pairs of eyes tracked the movement, expecting a weapon, expecting violence. Instead, Buck pulled out a single crushed Hershey's chocolate bar. The silver foil wrapper was torn. The chocolate inside had partially melted and reformed during the hot days and cold nights. But it was still chocolate. Real American chocolate. The last piece of home Buck had carried across the Pacific. He moved with exaggerated slowness, like approaching a spooked horse. He unwrapped the chocolate. The sound of foil crinkling seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Then he broke off a small square. The snap echoed like a gunshot. 12 women flinched. Buck raised the chocolate to his mouth, made deliberate eye contact with Emiko, and ate. He chewed slowly, swallowed, proving it was not poison. That this was not a trick. Just food. Just kindness. Then he held out the rest of the bar toward the cave entrance, toward Emiko. His hand was steady despite the fever, despite the fear, despite everything. The moment stretched. Time seemed to slow down. The jungle sounds faded. The morning light caught the chocolate, making it gleam like some kind of precious metal. Sweet cocoa scent drifted through the air, mixing impossibly with the smell of rotting vegetation and fear. This was not the devil they had been told about. This was a man with hollow eyes and dirt under his fingernails, offering them a miracle. Emiko crawled forward. Her knees scraped against the sharp limestone floor of the cave. The rocks cut through her thin uniform, but she did not take her eyes off Buck. She reached out. Her fingers touched his palm. Brief electric contact. Warmth against cold. Human skin against human skin. The first gentle touch any of them had experienced in months. She took the chocolate, held it like it was made of glass. Then she crawled back to the others. What happened next would stay with Buck Morrison for the rest of his life. The 12 women divided that chocolate bar into 12 exact portions. Mathematical precision born of desperate fairness. Each piece was microscopic, too small to really taste. But they ate with a reverence that felt like prayer. And in that moment, the first crack appeared in the propaganda. Because demons do not share chocolate. Monsters do not prove food is safe by eating it first. The blue-eyed devil they had been warned about did not have calloused hands that shook with fever and exhaustion. Yiko was the first to speak, the farmer's daughter. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the word was clear. Arigato. Thank you. Then again stronger. Arigato. Buck felt something break inside his chest, or maybe it was something being fixed. He could not tell which. But looking at 12 women dividing one chocolate square into pieces too small to taste, he realized something his training at Fort Benning had never taught him. These were not soldiers. These were not statistics. They were just people, daughters, sisters, mothers, human beings who had been chewed up by a machine bigger than any of them and spit out in this jungle to die. And Buck Morrison, farm boy from Fort Worth, Texas, made a decision in that moment. A decision that would either save 12 lives or cost him his own. He was going to keep them alive, but he could not act on that decision yet. Because there was something in the cave that would change everything. Half buried near the entrance, partially hidden by mud and debris, was a wooden crate. Imperial Army markings on the side. Buck had noticed it earlier, but had not investigated. Now with 12 women watching him with something that might have been the beginning of trust, he walked over to examine it. The lid had been smashed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of small objects. Buck lifted one into the light. A hand-carved wooden doll, delicate, beautiful. It was a teacher, complete with tiny chalk and book. Another doll showed a bride in traditional white kimono, a nurse with a Red Cross armband, a farmer with a hoe. Each doll represented one of the women. These were not weapons. These were going-home tokens, the kind of thing you make when you believe you will survive, when you have hope. Beneath the dolls were letters, unsealed, unfinished, never to be sent, and photographs. Emiko showed a young boy, maybe 8 years old, holding a schoolbook, her son Kenji. Buck's hands trembled as he dug deeper. At the very bottom, hidden beneath everything else, was a leather-bound ledger. Medical log. Official. He opened it. 12 names, 12 birth dates, 12 blood types, Unit 731 Auxiliary, Comfort Service. Then stamped in red ink across every page. Rejected. Insubordinate. And at the bottom, in handwriting that was almost casual in its bureaucratic efficiency, a single line. Disposal order. 18 January 1945. Oh, 600 hours. Grid reference followed. Buck checked his watch. It was 1300 hours. Same day. These women had been scheduled for execution 7 hours ago. They were not executed because they were dangerous. They were executed because they had said no. The weight of that realization hit Buck like a physical blow. His vision swam. Whether from malaria or moral outrage, he could not tell. These women were not enemy combatants. They were victims twice over. First by their own military, then by a war that saw them as nothing more than a logistical problem to be solved with a bullet. He turned to look at Emiko. She was watching him, waiting. She had seen him find the ledger. She knew what it meant. Buck walked over slowly, knelt down so they were at eye level. He showed her the ledger, pointed to the disposal order, then to his watch, then shook his head. No, he said, not happening, not on my watch. Emiko's face crumpled. The brittle dignity finally shattered. She broke down, not the quiet crying of grief, but the loud gasping sobs of someone who has been holding terror in siege for so long that when it finally breaks free, it comes out like a flood. The other women began to cry. Relief. Confusion. They did not understand English, but they understood Buck's tone. They understood the gentle way he had shown Emiko the ledger. They understood that for reasons they could not comprehend, this American soldier had decided they deserved to live. Buck Morrison sat back on his heels. His head was pounding, fever spiking again. He needed rest, water, probably actual medical attention. But that would have to wait, because keeping 12 women alive in enemy territory with no support and no orders was going to require more than good intentions. It would require every skill his daddy had taught him about protecting the weak, every lesson the ranch had taught him about making something out of nothing, every bit of a stubborn Texas determination he possessed. What Buck did not know yet was that in 96 hours he would face a choice that would put 12 lives on one side of the scale and his own military career and freedom on the other. He did not know that Captain Takeishi Sato, the man who had failed to execute his own sister, was still out there, still hunting, still trying to erase his dishonor with blood. And Buck certainly did not know that 70 years later, 91 descendants of these 12 women would gather in Hiroshima to honor the memory of one Texas cowboy who shared his last chocolate bar. All he knew in that moment was that he had made a promise, not with words, but with chocolate, with kindness, with the simple human acknowledgement that these women deserve to see another sunrise. Protect the weak. Keep your word. Never waste food. His daddy's rules. Simple. Clear. And in that Philippine jungle in January 1945, they were the only compass Buck Morrison needed. The first lesson Buck Morrison taught the 12 women was how to survive. Not just physically, though that was part of it, but how to survive the waiting, the uncertainty, the knowledge that every minute they stayed alive was borrowed time. He started with the practical things, the things a Texas rancher knew by instinct, which jungle roots were safe to eat and which would twist your gut into knots, how to catch rainwater in the broad banana leaves and let it filter through layers of moss into something almost clean, how to make fire without smoke that would signal their position to every Japanese patrol within 5 miles. The women watched him work with an intensity that went beyond mere observation. They were studying him, trying to reconcile the propaganda that had filled their heads since childhood with the reality of this man who moved with quiet efficiency and spoke in a low drawl that sounded nothing like the harsh barking they had been told all Americans used. Buck taught them to recognize the sound of different aircraft. The drone of a B-24 Liberator versus the higher-pitched whine of a Japanese Zero. The deep rumble of an M4 Sherman tank versus the lighter clatter of a Type 97 Shiha. Survival in a war zone meant knowing who was coming before they arrived. In exchange, the women taught Buck things the Army had never covered in jungle warfare training. Emiko showed him which leaves could reduce fever when chewed into a paste. Haruka demonstrated a Japanese field bandaging technique that used less material than the American method, but held just as tight. Aiko, the farmer's daughter, knew how to coax edible shoots from plants that looked completely dead. It was an exchange. Knowledge for knowledge. Trust built one small lesson at a time. Around 1600 hours, as the afternoon heat began to break, Buck pulled out his pack of Lucky Strikes, down to his last 3 cigarettes. He had been rationing them like gold. One cigarette could buy you almost anything from another soldier. A dry pair of socks, an extra can of rations, information. But looking at Emiko, who sat slightly apart from the others, with that brittle dignity still holding her together, Buck made a decision. He lit one of the Lucky Strikes. The sulfur smell of the match. The first draw of tobacco smoke, harsh and sweet at the same time. American tobacco was different from Japanese. Stronger, richer. He had heard that from prisoners before. He held the cigarette out to Emiko, offering. She looked at it for a long moment, then at Buck. Something shifted in her expression. She took the cigarette. Her fingers brushed his again. That same electric contact from the chocolate moment. She brought it to her lips and inhaled. The blue smoke curled between them in the heavy air, a bridge between two worlds that should have been at war. For just a moment, they were not soldier and prisoner, not American and Japanese, just two people sharing tobacco in the fading light. Emiko smiled, small, tired, but real. It reminded Buck of his oldest sister, Rachel, the way she would smile after a long day of work when they would sit on the porch and watch the sun go down over the ranch. How do you hate someone who reminds you of family? The answer Buck was learning was that you could not. Once you saw the humanity, you could not unsee it. Once you shared chocolate and tobacco and the quiet companionship of survival, the word enemy stopped meaning what it used to mean. Emiko spoke. Her English was careful, practiced. "We call you Tenshi no Hogosha," she said. Guardian angel. Buck shifted uncomfortably. Texas cowboys did not accept praise easily. It violated some unspoken code his daddy had drilled into him. "Ma'am," he said, "I am just doing what is right." Haruka spoke then, in Japanese. Emiko translated. "She says doing right when everyone expects evil, that is angel." The other women had gathered closer, all 12 watching him now, with something that looked dangerously close to hope. And then moving as one they bowed, deep, traditional. The kind of bow that carried weight, respect, gratitude. Buck felt his face heat. He wanted to tell them to stop, that he did not deserve this, that he was just a farm boy who could not stomach the thought of letting 12 women die when he had the means to keep them alive. But he kept quiet, because maybe they needed this. Maybe after months of being told they were worthless, disposable, maybe they needed to believe someone thought they were worth saving. The moment was broken by a sound from the jungle. Distant but distinct. Metal on metal, the click of equipment being adjusted. Buck was on his feet instantly, rifle up. Every sense suddenly sharp despite the fever still burning in his blood. The women went silent. Even their breathing seemed to stop. Nothing moved in the underbrush. But Buck had learned to trust his instincts. The jungle had a rhythm. When that rhythm changed, it meant danger. We need to talk about Captain Takeishi Sato now. Because while Buck Morrison was learning to see the humanity in his enemies, Takeishi was hunting his own sister through the jungle with murder on his mind. Takeishi was 32 years old. He had joined the Imperial Army when he was 18. Fresh-faced, idealistic, a true believer in Bushido, in the code that said honor was more precious than life, that death was preferable to shame, that absolute obedience to the emperor was the highest virtue a man could possess. For 14 years, that code had sustained him. It had given meaning to the violence, purpose to the sacrifice. When he killed, it was for honor. When he ordered men to their deaths, it was for the glory of the empire. But now that code had become a noose around his neck. The disposal order had come down the chain of command like any other. 12 women, rejected for service, insubordinate. Security risk, execute at 0600 hours, 18th January. Simple, clean, bureaucratic. Takeshi had read the list of names, and there at the top marked as subject number 1 was Emiko Sato, his older sister, the woman who had raised him after their parents died, who had taught him to read, who had written him letters every week during his first year in the army when homesickness threatened to break him, who had a son named Kenji that Takeshi had held as a baby and promised to protect always. Bushido said obey orders. Blood said protect family. The two imperatives were tearing Takeshi apart. He had made a compromise. A coward's compromise, he knew, but a compromise nonetheless. He would take the women to the disposal location, but he would not execute them himself. He would leave them in the jungle. Let the Americans find them. Let nature take its course. Either way, his hands would be clean. Technically, he would have followed orders. The women would be disposed of. But Emiko would not die by his hand. For 3 days, Takeshi had told himself this was the honorable solution. But honor had a way of rotting in the jungle heat. And now knowing that his sister was still alive, possibly in American custody, possibly revealing information about Unit 731 that could bring shame on the entire military, Takeshi faced a choice. Let her live and risk dishonor to the empire, or finish what he should have done 3 days ago. He had 2 soldiers with him, both starving, both desperate, both willing to follow orders without question because following orders was easier than thinking about what those orders meant. They had been tracking the Americans' position since dawn, boot prints in the mud, broken branches where someone had moved through the undergrowth without proper jungle training, the faint smell of tobacco smoke on the wind. They were close now, maybe 200 meters, close enough to hear voices if they listened carefully. Takeshi checked his weapon. The bayonet was sharp, the rifle loaded. At exactly 2000 hours when the light was failing and the American's guard might be down, Takeshi would make his move. He would kill the American first. Quick, efficient. Then he would execute all 12 women, just as he should have done 3 days ago, and the dishonor would be erased. The mission completed. His hands were shaking. But Takeshi told himself it was anticipation, not fear, not guilt. A samurai did not feel guilt for doing his duty. The question was whether Takeshi still believed that. Night fell fast in the jungle. One moment there was light, the next darkness so complete it felt solid. The temperature dropped, not cold by Texas standards, but enough to make the constant dampness seep into your bones. Buck had risked a small fire in the mouth of the cave, just enough to provide warmth. The smoke would dissipate in the thick canopy. Probably, it was a calculated risk. But the women were shivering. Haruka's medical training told her that hypothermia could kill as surely as bullets. They huddled around the flames, 12 women and 1 Texas cowboy. The firelight carved deep shadows in the limestone walls, made everything look ancient, primal, like they had slipped backward through time to some era before nations and armies and all the machinery of modern war. Emiko sat closest to Buck. Not out of favoritism, but because she was the only one who could translate. The other women peppered her with questions in rapid Japanese. She answered patiently, explaining who Buck was, where he came from, why he had chosen to help them. Buck caught his own name several times, Morrison-san. The honorific sounded strange attached to his last name. But there was respect in it, maybe even affection. Around 1930 hours, Buck felt the fever spike again. His vision swam. The cave walls seemed to breathe in and out like living things. He tried to stand to move away from the fire before he collapsed in front of them, but his legs would not obey. Haruka was beside him instantly, her hands cool against his forehead. Professional. Assessing. She spoke to Emiko in rapid Japanese. Emiko translated. She says you have malaria. Bad. You need medicine. Quinine. Buck laughed. It came out bitter. Tell her the quinine is back at base camp. About 40 miles that way. He gestured vaguely east. Haruka did not smile. She pulled out a small cloth bundle from the folds of her torn uniform. Inside were leaves, bark, things Buck did not recognize. She began to grind them between two rocks, added a little water from the canteen, made a paste that looked like mud and smelled like earth and something medicinal. She gestured for Buck to drink. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed not to ingest unknown substances in enemy territory. But then he looked at Haruka's face, at the professional concern there, at the healer's need to heal regardless of nationality or uniform. Buck drank. It tasted like dirt and bitterness. But within 20 minutes, the fever began to break. The shaking eased. His vision cleared. Haruka watched him improve with satisfaction. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and placed her hand over his heart, just for a second. A gesture of connection, of shared humanity. Emiko translated. She says her sister died in Osaka. American bombs. She hated Americans for a long time. But you show her hate is choice, not destiny. Buck felt his throat tighten. He wanted to apologize. For the bombs, for the war, for everything. But words felt inadequate. Instead, he just nodded. Met Haruka's eyes, hoped she could see that he understood, that he carried his own grief, his own losses. The moment stretched, peaceful, almost tender. Then the attack came, 2000 hours exactly. Takeshi Sato erupted from the tree line with a scream that was half battle cry and half something darker. Pain, rage, desperation. His bayonet was raised, the blade caught the firelight. For one frozen second, Buck saw everything with perfect clarity. Takeshi's face twisted in anguish. The two soldiers flanking him, and the target of the bayonet thrust. Not Buck. Emiko. Buck moved on instinct. He threw himself sideways, grabbed his rifle. But the barrel was slick with condensation. His hands fumbled. The safety would not release. Takeshi was almost on top of Emiko. She had not moved, just stared at her younger brother with an expression of profound sadness. Takeshi screamed something in Japanese. Emiko whispered something back. Later, she would translate for Buck. Takeshi had screamed, "Traitor, sister. You dishonor our family name." And Emiko had whispered, "I forgive you, little brother." The bayonet descended. Buck's rifle finally came up. But in the split second before he could fire, Haruka launched herself at Takeshi. She hit him low, shoulder into his midsection. The two of them went down in a tangle. The bayonet skittered across the cave floor. One of Takeshi's soldiers fired wildly. The muzzle flash turned everything into a strobing nightmare of light and shadow. Buck heard a scream, high-pitched, pained. He spun. Haruka was on the ground, blood blooming across her shoulder, dark and hot. The fabric of her uniform turning black with it. The women erupted, not in panic, but in fury. All 12 descended on Takeshi and his soldiers like avenging angels, clawing, hitting, a mass of desperate humanity that overwhelmed training and weapons through sheer determination. Buck fired once, twice. One soldier went down, the other fled into the jungle, and Takeshi, disarmed, was pinned beneath a pile of women who had decided they had been victims long enough. But Buck barely registered any of that, because Haruka was bleeding, and bleeding badly. He dropped his rifle, fell to his knees beside her. His hands were shaking again, but not from fever this time, from adrenaline, from fear. The women pulled back, expecting Buck to finish what the violence had started, expecting the devil to show his true face now that blood had been spilled. Instead, Buck tore open his first aid pouch, the sulfur powder, the same packet that had saved countless American lives. He was about to use it on the enemy. The question flashed through his mind. Is there a point where the will to save an enemy becomes a betrayal of your own flag? But the question disappeared as fast as it came. Because Haruka was not the enemy. She was a healer who had saved his life an hour ago. She was a sister who had lost her family to American bombs and still chose mercy. She was a human being bleeding out on a cave floor, and Buck Morrison had been taught to protect the weak. He poured the white powder into the wound. Haruka arched her back, screamed. The sting was intense, chemical burn meeting torn flesh. But the powder would prevent infection, would stop the bleeding. Emiko moved without being asked. She grabbed Haruka's good shoulder. pinned her to the ground, spoke fiercely in Japanese. Not comfort, a command. Stay still. Let him work. Buck worked with the focused intensity he had learned from years of ranch medicine. Horses with barbed wire cuts, cattle with infected hooves, his sisters with playground injuries that needed more than just a bandage and a kiss. He used the canteen water, precious, limited, but necessary to clean the periphery of the wound. He packed the injury with gauze from his kit, wrapped it tight. His hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the trembling. When he was done, he sat back, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool night air. The women watched him. 12 pairs of eyes seeing something that did not match any propaganda they had ever heard. They watched the sweat, the shaking hands, the exhaustion of trying to preserve a single fragile life, and the old terror that had defined them for so long began to transform into something else. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the possibility of trust. The first green shoot of hope pushing up through scorched earth. Haruka whispered something. Arigato Tenshi-san. Thank you, Angel. Buck looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood. American sulfur powder. Japanese blood. The mixture looked the same as any other. Red. Human. Behind him, Takeshi Sato lay bound with strips of torn uniform. Emiko stood over her brother. Her face was unreadable. She held the bayonet he had tried to kill her with. One thrust, and she could end him. Justice, revenge, self-defense. But she did not move, just stood there, looking at the man who had been ordered to execute her and had failed twice now. First by abandoning them, then by attacking and missing. Buck forced himself to stand, walked over to Emiko, gently took the bayonet from her hand. She looked at him. "What do I do?" she asked. The English words came out broken, uncertain. Buck looked at Takeishi. The man was conscious, watching. His face was a mask of shame and rage and something that might have been relief. "We keep him alive," Buck said, "just like the rest of you." "But he tried to kill us," Emiko said. "I know," Buck replied, "but killing him will not undo that, and it will make you something you are not." "What am I?" Emiko asked. The question was genuine. After everything, she truly did not know anymore. Buck thought about his daddy's rules, about the ranch, about the America he had crossed the ocean to defend. "You are someone who chose mercy when it cost everything," he said. "Do not stop now." Emiko looked at her brother, then back at Buck. Finally she nodded, slowly, painfully, but definite. She spoke to Takeshi in Japanese. Buck did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Forgiveness, grief, love mixed with disappointment, all the complicated feelings that come from family betrayal. Takeshi began to cry, not the loud sobs that Emiko had shown earlier, but silent tears that ran down his face and dripped onto the cave floor. Shame made visible. The night passed in tense vigilance. Buck stayed awake, rifle across his lap. Takeshi bound securely. The women slept in shifts. Haruka's breathing was steady. The wound was holding. As dawn broke on January 19th, Buck faced a new problem. He now had 13 prisoners of war, 12 women and 1 officer, no transport, no orders, and a deadline that had passed 3 days ago. But that problem would become acute in ways Buck could not imagine, because at 0900 hours on January 21st, an American patrol would walk into that clearing. And what they saw would look nothing like duty and everything like treason. The question that would define the next 70 years was simple. Can a man serve his country and his conscience? At the same time, Buck Morrison was about to find out. Before we see what happens when Buck's own people arrive, think about this. Have you ever had to choose between following orders and doing what you knew was right? Have you ever stood at that crossroads where duty and morality pulled you in opposite directions? Drop your story in the comments. We read every one. And if this video is giving you a new perspective on an old war, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about duty and honor. The American patrol appeared like ghosts materializing from the green wall. 8 men, full combat gear, fresh uniforms, weapons at the ready. They moved with the professional caution of soldiers who had seen too much combat to take anything for granted. Leading them was Sergeant Ray Donovan, 42 years old, 20 years in the Army. He had fought in the First World War, had seen the Bataan Death March aftermath. He carried the kind of weariness that came from watching too many good men die for reasons that made less sense the longer you thought about them. Donovan saw Buck first, bearded, filthy, uniform torn and stained with mud and blood and God knows what else. Then his eyes moved to the cave entrance, to the 12 women huddled there, to the bound Japanese officer, to the whole impossible scene. His Thompson submachine gun came up. Leveled at Buck's chest, Morrison Donovan said. His voice sounded like gravel grinding under boot heels. You are the one who went missing at the ridge. Buck stood slowly, hands visible, non-threatening, but he did not put down his rifle. Yes, Sergeant. Donovan's eyes moved over the scene again, taking in details. The fire, the shared supplies, the way the women were gathered protectively around Buck, the obvious care that had been taken with the wounded one. What the hell is this, Morrison Donovan asked. The question came out flat. Dangerous. You running a refugee camp or a harem? The word hit Buck like a slap. He felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. They are non-combatants, Sarge. Auxiliaries. He pulled the leather-bound ledger from his pack, tossed it at Donovan's feet. Look at the dates, he said. Look at the notations. Their own people were going to dispose of them 3 days ago. I did not capture them. I pulled them out of a grave their own officers dug. Donovan did not look at the ledger. His eyes were locked on Buck, calculating, assessing. The men behind him were shifting, uncomfortable. They had expected to find a missing soldier, maybe a body, not this. Private Eddie Kowalski, who had trained with Buck at Fort Benning, whispered just loud enough to be heard. Jesus Christ, Morrison. What happened to you out here? Buck wanted to laugh, or scream, or both. What happened was he had remembered what his daddy taught him about protecting the weak. What happened was he had chosen to see people instead of propaganda. What happened was the war had gotten small, impersonal, and impossibly complicated. But he did not say any of that. He just met Donovan's eyes and waited. That was when Emiko stepped forward. She moved with that brittle dignity intact despite everything. Her English was clear, practiced, brave. I am Emiko Sato, she said. English teacher, Kyoto Prefecture. We were Unit 731 Auxiliary, rejected for forced prostitution. Our own officers ordered our execution. This man saved our lives when he could have taken them. She pulled out the photograph of her son Kenji, held it up so the patrol could see. I have 8-year-old son, she said. This man made it possible I see him again. That is not war crime. That is American value. Freedom, dignity, mercy. The words hung in the humid air. American value, coming from a Japanese woman, about an American soldier. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. Then Haruka stood, slower, favoring her wounded shoulder. She pulled aside the bandage, showed the fresh injury, the American sulfur powder, the careful field dressing. Emiko translated. She is medical orderly. She lost sister in Osaka firebombing. American bombs. She had every reason to hate Americans. But this man saved her life. Professional to professional, human to human. Haruka spoke again. Just 2 words, but clear. Watashi wa yurusu. Emiko translated. I forgive. The patrol stood frozen. These were men who had been trained to see the Japanese as subhuman, as fanatical monsters who would never surrender, who would choose death over dishonor, who could not be trusted or reasoned with. But here was a Japanese woman forgiving Americans for killing her sister. Here was evidence of mercy flowing both directions across the battle lines. And then Takeishi spoke. Still bound, still on the ground. But his English was perfect, formal. Sergeant Donovan, he said, I am Captain Takeishi Sato, Imperial Japanese Army. I ordered these women's execution. This American prevented a war crime. By Bushido code, he has more honor than I do. The confession should have been a victory. Enemy officer admitting guilt, validating Buck's actions. But instead, it just made everything more complicated. Because if Buck was right, then what did that say about all the other orders, all the other times soldiers had followed commands without question? What did it say about the machine of war itself? Donovan finally picked up the ledger. Read it. His face was unreadable. 20 years in the Army had taught him to hide his thoughts. But Buck saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he read the disposal order. He looked at the 12 women, really looked at them. And Buck saw the moment when Donovan's daughter back in Chicago superimposed herself over these foreign faces. She was 19, about the same age as some of them. Morrison Donovan said finally, "You are a goddamn fool." Buck's heart sank. Here it came. The arrest, the court-martial. The end. "But you are an honorable fool," Donovan finished. He lowered his weapon, gestured for the patrol to do the same. "We are evacuating these POWs to Manzanar Internment Facility, California. They will be processed, treated humanely. Captain Sato goes to Sugamo Prison for officers. As for you," he paused, looked at Buck for a long moment. "Official record says Private Morrison recovered 13 enemy POWs, one requiring medical treatment. No misconduct observed. Unofficially, I am writing you up for commendation. Probably will not get approved, but it will be on file." Buck felt something loosen in his chest, not quite relief, but close. "You are being reassigned." Donovan continued. "Different unit. Loose lips about this incident could cause problems. Understand?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Good." He turned to his men. "Get transport on the radio. We are moving out in 1 hour." The next 60 minutes passed in a blur. Logistics, processing, the machinery of military bureaucracy grinding into motion. The women were given water, food, basic medical attention. They were treated correctly, but there was a distance now. They had gone from people back to prisoners, from individuals back to numbers on a form. Buck watched it happen, hated it, but understood it. The Army could not function on personal connection. It needed categories, procedures, rules. Emiko approached him as the trucks were arriving. She stopped at the cave entrance, turned. The MPs tried to move her along, but she planted her feet. Donovan made a gesture. Let her talk. Emiko reached into her sleeve, pulled out the wooden teacher doll from the crate, the one with the tiny chalk and book. She pressed it into Buck's hand. Her fingers lingered against his skin. That same electric warmth from the chocolate and the cigarette. "In Japan," she said, "we say ichigo ichie, one time, one meeting. Every encounter is once in lifetime. Must be treasured." Buck felt his throat close. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his mother's silver locket, the only photograph he had of his parents. He had carried it across the Pacific, through every battle. It was the most precious thing he owned. He pressed it into Emiko's hand. "For Kenji," he said, "tell him his mother is brave." Emiko's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Guardian Angel Morrison-san. You teach me enemy is word politicians use. Human is what we truly are." Then Haruka was there, bowing deeply despite her wounded shoulder. "Arigato gozaimasu," the deepest form of gratitude in Japanese. And Yuki, still shy, still fragile, but alive. She tried to return the comb Buck had given her. "You keep," she whispered. "Remember us," Iko shouted from the truck. "Chocolate Day, every year, January 18. We remember." 12 hands waving, Buck saluted. Military precision to cover the fact that his eyes were burning and his chest felt like it was being crushed. The trucks pulled away. Dust billowing, diesel exhaust mixing with jungle rot, and then they were gone. Buck Morrison stood in that clearing surrounded by his own people, speaking his own language, back with the familiar comfort of American uniforms and sea rations. But the world no longer fit him. He had crossed a line somewhere in those 3 days, and he could not uncross it. He looked down at the wooden doll in his palm, tiny, delicate, a teacher with chalk and book, a reminder that the enemy has a heartbeat. How much of our identity is just the uniform we are told to wear? Buck Morrison did not have an answer, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never forget 12 women dividing one chocolate bar into microscopic pieces and eating it like prayer. He would never forget Haruka forgiving American bombs. He would never forget Emiko calling mercy an American value. And somewhere deep in his Texas soul, Buck made a promise. If he survived this war, if he made it home, he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve the title they had given him. Guardian Angel. even if it took 70 years to understand what that really meant. 7 years is a long time to carry ghosts. Buck Morrison learned this on the slow boat back to San Francisco in November 1945. Japan had surrendered 3 months earlier. The war was over. Men were going home. But Buck stood at the railing watching the Pacific roll beneath him and felt nothing that resembled victory. He had been reassigned after the incident with the 12 women. 11th Airborne Division. Different campaign, different men who did not know his story, but they noticed the change in him anyway. "You fight different," Private Eddie Kowalski had told him once. They had been reassigned together, old training buddies from Fort Benning, reunited by the random machinery of military logistics. "You fight like you are protecting something instead of destroying something." Buck had not known how to respond to that. How do you explain that once you see the humanity in the enemy combat stops being about hatred and starts being about something sadder, necessity, duty, the grim mathematics of kill or be killed, but never hatred? He carried 3 wooden dolls in his rucksack: the teacher, the nurse, the farmer, Emiko, Haruka, Aiko. Every night, no matter how exhausted, he would take them out, line them up on whatever surface was available: a ammunition crate, a fallen log, once the hood of a Jeep, and he would eat 1 square of Hershey's chocolate if he could find it. A ritual, a remembrance, a promise that he was still the man who had chosen mercy in that Philippine cave. The other soldiers thought he was crazy, or maybe suffering from shell shock. They left him alone, which was fine. Buck had grown comfortable with solitude in ways he never had been before the war. When VJ Day came on August 15, 1945, Buck was in a field hospital recovering from a minor shrapnel wound. Nothing serious, but enough to keep him off the line when the news broke. The hospital erupted in celebration. Men were crying, laughing, hugging strangers. The war was over. They had won. They were going home. Buck sat on his cot and thought about 12 women. Were they still alive? Had they survived? Manzanar, had they been repatriated to Japan, or were they still in California? Did Emiko ever see her son Kenji again? Did Haruka's shoulder heal properly? He had tried to find out. Written letters to the War Department, to the Red Cross, to Manzanar directly before it closed. But the bureaucracy was enormous, and Buck was just one private asking about enemy civilians. His letters went unanswered, or came back with form responses that told him nothing. Eventually, he stopped asking. Not because he stopped caring, but because not knowing was easier than knowing they might have died despite everything. The assumption became his new reality. They had moved on, returned to Japan, started new lives, forgotten the Texas cowboy who shared chocolate during 3 impossible days. It was easier to believe that than to hope for something more. Buck Morrison came home to Fort Worth on a gray November morning. The train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and the screech of brakes. His 4 sisters were waiting on the platform. Rachel, who was 17 now, not the 12-year-old girl who had cried when he enlisted. The others had grown too, married, started families of their own. They threw their arms around him, asked questions he could not answer, wanted stories he could not tell. They meant well, but they were trying to welcome home a man who no longer existed. The Buck Morrison who had left Fort Worth in 1941 had believed in clear lines between good and evil, between us and them. That Buck had died somewhere in a Philippine cave and been replaced by someone who understood that the world was mostly gray. He took over the ranch, worked the land, fixed fences, raised cattle. The rhythm of ranch life was supposed to be healing, familiar routines, honest work, the Texas sky stretching forever. But Buck found himself staring at the horizon and thinking about a cave halfway around the world. He never married. When people asked why, he would make jokes about being too set in his ways. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. How do you build a life with someone when part of your heart is still on the other side of the Pacific? The wooden dolls sat on his mantel, 3 of them arranged in a careful line. Visitors would ask about them. Buck would say they were souvenirs from the war. Most people did not push further. Veterans were allowed their quirks, their silences, their private griefs. Every January 18th, Buck would wake before dawn. He would ride out to the north pasture where his father was buried. and he would eat one square of Hershey's chocolate while watching the sun come up. Chocolate Day. That was what Aiko had shouted from the truck, the last thing he had heard before they disappeared into the dust. He wondered if they remembered too. If somewhere in Japan 12 women were eating chocolate and thinking about a cave and a cowboy in 3 days when the war became human-sized. Buck would never know. That was what he told himself. And for 7 years he believed it. Then came June 1952. The postman arrived at the ranch around 10 in the morning. The heat was already brutal, 105 degrees in the shade, the kind of Texas summer that made you understand why people invented air conditioning. Buck was working on a water pump in the south pasture, wrench in hand, sweat pouring down his face. The postman's truck kicked up a plume of dust visible from a mile away. "Got something for you," the postman called. "Letter from Japan." "You got family over there?" Buck's hands went still. The wrench slipped, clattered against the metal pump. He walked over slowly, like approaching a spooked horse, not wanting to startle the moment into disappearing. The envelope was thin, lightweight. The address written in careful feminine script, Japanese stamps in the corner, and pressed inside visible through the paper was the shape of something flat and delicate. Buck's hands were shaking, just like that first chocolate moment, just like the fever. He opened the envelope with exaggerated care. A pressed orchid fell out, purple and gold, the colors of Philippine jungle light filtering through mahogany leaves. And a letter, 3 pages. English. The handwriting precise. "Dear Guardian Angel Morrison San, 7 years is very long time. I hope you remember English teacher from Philippines cave. I remember Texas cowboy who gave chocolate when we expected death. I must tell you 3 things. First, all 12 alive. Every January 18th we meet in Kyoto. We call it Chocolate Day. We eat Hershey's bar, very expensive in Japan, but we save money all year. We tell our children about Guardian Angel. So far, 23 children born to 12 women. 23 lives exist because you choose mercy. Second, my son, Kenji, now 15 years old, study English because he want meet Guardian Angel someday. He want to say thank you for saving his mother. I show him your mother's locket every day. Tell him this is what honor looks like. Third, I teach English at Fukuoka school. Every year I tell students about American cowboy who save enemy lives. I not use your name, you maybe not want famous, but I teach them humanity is bigger than war. We have reunion August 1952, Tokyo. All 12 invite you. Please come. We want to say thank you. We want to show you your mercy multiplied across 70 lives now. 12 women, 23 children, husbands, parents. You give us chocolate. We give you proof that kindness never dies. With deepest gratitude forever, Emiko Sato. And your 12 angels. P.S. Do you still have wooden doll? I have your mother's locket. We trade back. Buck read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. The words blurred. He realized he was crying. First time since his brother had died at Anzio. 7 years of holding everything inside, and now it all came out at once. 23 children. His mercy had multiplied. 1 chocolate bar had become 23 lives. And they remembered. Every year on Chocolate Day, they remembered. Buck's sisters tried to talk him out of going. Japan was still enemy territory in their minds. Occupied but hostile. What if it was a trap? What if the letter was fake? But Buck knew Emiko's handwriting. He had watched her practice English letters in the dirt of that cave with a stick. Careful, precise, the same loops and curves. He booked passage to Japan. August 1952, 7 years after the surrender. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks. Every day felt like a year. Buck stood at the ship's railing and watched the ocean that had separated him from 12 women who had taught him what mercy really meant. The water was beautiful, terrifying, endless. A businessman traveling to Tokyo for trade deals struck up a conversation, asked Buck why he was visiting Japan. "To see old friends," Buck said. The businessman's face twisted in disgust. Friends with Japs after what they did at Pearl Harbor. Buck did not argue. He had learned that some people needed enemies more than they needed truth. Instead, he just looked out at the horizon and thought about Haruka whispering, "Watashi wa yurusu." I forgive. The ship docked at Yokohama on August 17th. The heat and humidity hit Buck like a physical blow. It smelled like the Philippines, wet earth, growing things, memory. He took a train to Tokyo, then another to Fukuoka. The Japan he saw from the windows was recovering but still scarred. 7 years after the atomic bombs, the rebuilding was ongoing. But there was life, movement, hope. Fukuoka School was a modest building, traditional architecture mixed with post-war pragmatism. Buck arrived on August 18th, Chocolate Day, the anniversary. A banner hung over the entrance, English and Japanese. Welcome, Guardian Angel Morrison-san. Buck stopped walking, stared at the banner. Part of him wanted to turn around, get back on the ship, go home. Because what if the reality could not live up to 7 years of memory? But then Emiko walked out of the school building. She was 42 now. Gray streaked her hair. She wore reading glasses, a teacher's modest dress. But her eyes were the same, warm, intelligent, alive. She saw him, froze. Then she ran, dignity forgotten, just pure joy propelling her forward. They embraced in the school courtyard. No words, just 7 years of distance collapsing into one moment. Buck felt her shake with sobs, felt his own tears soaking into her hair. You came, she whispered in English. You really came. You asked, Buck said. His voice was rough, broken. That is enough. A teenage boy appeared in the doorway, tall, serious, Kenji. He approached slowly, bowed. His English was careful, formal. Thank you for saving Mother. Buck knelt, eye level with the boy, pulled the wooden teacher doll from his pocket, had carried it across the Pacific. Your mother saved me too, he said. He pressed the doll into Kenji's hands. Kenji looked at the tiny carved figure, at the chalk and book, then at his mother. He smiled, and Buck saw Emiko's warmth reflected in her son's face. The school gymnasium had been converted for the reunion, traditional Japanese setup, low tables, tatami mats, the smell of green tea and orchid incense, everything clean, careful, respectful. The women arrived one by one. Each entrance was a small miracle. Haruka came first, age 35 now, doctor at Hiroshima Hospital. She wore a white coat even though this was not a medical setting, professional to the core. She showed Buck her shoulder, healed perfectly. Just a scar, but the shoulder worked, moved, saved lives. She bowed deep. Spoke in Japanese, Emiko translated. Your sulfur powder saved my shoulder. I used that shoulder to deliver 847 babies at Hiroshima Hospital. Each one I thought Guardian Angel made this possible. Then Yuki, age 24, married to a gentle bookstore owner. She carried a little girl on her hip, 4 years old. Megumi, blessing. That was what the name meant. Yuki still had the comb, Buck's mother's comb. She had worn it in her hair on her wedding day. The photo showed her in traditional white kimono, hair decorated with the comb and flowers. I tell Megumi about American Angel who saved her grandmother's life, Yuki said. Her English had improved. 7 years of practice. She want meet you. The little girl stared at Buck with enormous eyes, whispered something to her mother. She asked if you have wings, Yuki translated. Angels have wings in picture books. Buck laughed. First real laugh in 7 years. No wings, he said, just cowboy boots. Aiko arrived with characteristic exuberance. Her laugh unchanged, loud, joyful, infectious. She brought homemade pickles. Shinko. Like the jungle roots we ate, she shouted. But better, she had married a farmer. 3 sons. The farm prospered. I tell husband I had 12 sisters and 1 brother in war, she said. He very confused. Then Setsuko, the one who had been 8 weeks pregnant in the cave. Her son Mamoru was 6 now, named Protector, Guardian. He bowed to Buck with exquisite politeness. I was 8 weeks pregnant in jungle, Setsuko said through Emiko. If I die, baby die. You saved 2 lives, not 1. The twins, Fumiko and Chio, age 38 now. They had returned to Tokyo, opened a small restaurant together. The menu featured chocolate-themed desserts, a tribute. They brought a gift, the Hershey's wrapper from that first chocolate bar. Somehow preserved, flattened, framed. We keep this, they said. Remind us smallest gift can save life. 6 others came, each with families, husbands, children, stories of survival and rebuilding, of lives that continued because one Texas cowboy had chosen mercy over orders. Buck tried to count. 12 women, 23 children, 11 husbands, others. The gymnasium was full, maybe 60 people total, all here because of one chocolate bar. The weight of that realization was overwhelming. Emiko called for silence, stood at the front of the room. Her English was flawless now. 7 years of teaching had polished away any hesitation. On January 18th, 1945, she said, "We expect death, we receive chocolate. Today, August 18th, 1952, we have 23 children. Tomorrow's children, hope's children, all exist because one man chose mercy over hate." She gestured to the center table where 15 wooden dolls were arranged. The 12 original ones plus Buck's 3. A complete family reunited. Buck Morrison did not win the war, Emiko continued, but he won something more important. He won proof that humanity is bigger than propaganda, that kindness multiplies, that mercy never dies. Then came the ceremony. Each woman broke off a piece of Hershey's chocolate, but this time, instead of dividing it among themselves, they fed it to Buck, one by one, reversing the ritual from 7 years ago. The sensory overload was intense, 12 chocolate bars snapping in sequence. The sound, like gentle rifle reports. The smell of cocoa mixing with tatami grass and green tea. The taste of chocolate, familiar but transformed by context. Celebration instead of survival. The visual contrast. 12 faces smiling through tears versus 12 faces terrified in a cave. The touch. Gentle hands offering chocolate versus desperate hands grabbing it. Buck Morrison sat surrounded by 60 lives and understood something profound. Mercy was not a one-time thing. It was a seed, and seeds multiplied. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you could go back in time and thank someone who showed you mercy when you needed it most, who would it be? Leave their name in the comments. Maybe they will see it. And if this story is touching you, share it with a veteran in your life. They will understand why Buck crossed an ocean for a chocolate bar. Now something is about to happen that will bring everyone in this room to tears, because Emiko's younger brother Takeishi is about to walk through that door. Takeshi Sato had been released from Sugamo prison 6 months earlier. 7 years for war crimes, attempting to execute civilians without trial. He had served his time, but the sentence had changed him. Prison had stripped away the Bushido code that had sustained him, replaced certainty with doubt, replaced pride with humility. He was 39 now, thin, worn, no longer an officer, just a man trying to understand how honor had led him so far astray. He had spent 6 months searching for this reunion, traveling across Japan, asking questions, following rumors, because he needed to apologize, not to ease his own conscience, but because Emiko and the 11 others deserved to hear it. He entered the gymnasium slowly. Every eye turned to him. Some of the women stiffened, memory of his bayonet still fresh despite 7 years. Takeshi walked to the center, knelt, pressed his forehead to the tatami mat, the deepest form of apology in Japanese culture. Total submission, complete humility. He spoke in Japanese. Emiko translated for Buck. Her voice shook but held steady. "Morrison-san, I tried to kill you. I tried to kill my own sister. I followed orders I knew were evil because I was a coward. You followed conscience when it cost everything. You are samurai, I am not. Can you forgive me?" The room held its breath. Buck stood, walked over, helped Takeshi to his feet. Texas cowboys did not bow, but they understood regret. They understood the weight of choices made in impossible situations. "Captain Sato," Buck said, "you could not kill your sister. That took more courage than following orders. You left them in that jungle, hoping someone would show mercy. I just happened to be there. We both made choices, different paths, same destination. Them being alive." He extended his hand. Takeshi stared at it, then took it. The grip firm, equal. Brothers through Emiko, former enemies now bound by shared failure and shared redemption. Takeshi pulled something from his coat. Emiko's locket. Buck's mother's locket. Emiko had given it to her brother years ago, hoping it would remind him of humanity. Buck took it, turned it over in his hands. The silver was tarnished, but the photograph inside was intact. His parents on their wedding day, young, hopeful, before the ranch, before the hard years, before death. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver harmonica. His father had carried it in the First World War, had played it on the ranch porch on Sunday evenings. It was one of Buck's most precious possessions. He pressed it into Takeishi's hands, symbol of peace, of music instead of war, of breath creating beauty instead of carrying screams. Takeishi's face crumpled. He clutched the harmonica like a lifeline, bowed again, not the formal apology, but gratitude. Buck lifted the harmonica to his lips, played a few notes. Home on the Range, slow, emotional. The Texas anthem transformed into a Japanese peace offering. The children listened in wonder. First American music for many of them. The melody simple, haunting. Yuki's daughter Megumi whispered sounds like freedom. Buck taught them the chorus. 60 Japanese voices singing a Texas cowboy song in broken English. The sound filled the gymnasium, spilled out into the August evening. Freedom and hope mixed together until you could not tell where one ended and the other began. From terror in a cave to music in a school, 7 years. One mercy's echo multiplying across generations. Flash forward now. 1976, the same Fukuoka school, now renamed Kyoto Academy. Unity Academy. Imako had retired from active teaching, but the school continued her lessons. A Japanese filmmaker arrived with cameras and questions. He had heard rumors, stories, about 12 women and an American cowboy in chocolate. He wanted to document it before the generation that remembered firsthand was gone. Buck Morrison was 55 now, silver in his hair, lines in his face from Texas sun and ranch work, but his eyes still carried that same intensity, that same recognition of shared humanity. The filmmaker interviewed everyone. Buck, all 12 women, the second generation. Kenji, now 39, an engineer. Megumi, now 28, an English teacher like her grandmother Emiko. The documentary was titled The Chocolate Protocol. When Mercy multiplied, Haruka, age 59, spoke directly to camera. His sulfur powder saved my shoulder. I used that shoulder to deliver 847 babies at Hiroshima Hospital. Each one I thought Guardian Angel made this possible. That is not 847 lives. That is 847 families. Thousands of people exist because one man chose kindness. The documentary won awards, was shown in Japanese schools, a few American schools. Veterans groups initially hostile softened when they saw the evidence. Letters arrived at Buck's ranch. Other veterans thanking him, some apologizing for judging, others sharing their own stories of mercy shown and received. One letter stood out, from a veteran who had fought at Okinawa. Brutal campaign, no mercy given or expected. I hated the Japs for 30 years, the letter said. Your story made me realize I was carrying dead weight. Thank you for showing a different way. Buck kept that letter on his mantle next to the wooden dolls, proof that the story mattered, that sharing it could change minds. Jump forward again. January 18th, 2015. 70 years after that cave, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, a monument was being unveiled. The Guardian Angel Memorial, bronze statue of a soldier sharing chocolate with a child. Simple, powerful, universal. The plaque read in English and Japanese, in memory of Private James Morrison and all who choose mercy over hatred. The attendance was staggering. 8 of the original 12 were still alive, ages 85 to 95. Emiko, Haruka, Yuki, Aiko, Setsuko, and 3 others, moving slowly but present, determined. The second generation, 23 now adults, middle-aged, successful, teachers, doctors, engineers, business owners. The third generation, 41 grandchildren, young adults and teenagers. The fourth generation, 19 great-grandchildren, babies and toddlers, 91 descendants total, all gathered to honor one chocolate bar, one choice, one moment of mercy. Yuki stood at the podium, age 87, frail but fierce. Her great-great-granddaughter sat in the front row. 5 years old, named Chocoreto, chocolate in Japanese. A living tribute. I am 87 years old, Yuki said in English. Accented but clear. In 1945, I was 17 and wanted to die. American cowboy gave me chocolate, gave me comb, told me I was beautiful. Today, I am great-great-grandmother of 5. Everyone carries Buck Morrison's gift. Belief that kindness is stronger than war. She held up the comb. Still had it. 70 years later. Still beautiful. Still grateful. The crowd erupted in applause. Not polite, but thunderous, sustained. 91 descendants standing. Clapping, crying, celebrating. Buck Morrison had died in 1982, age 61, heart failure on his Texas ranch. He never married, never had biological children. But looking at 91 people gathered in his honor, the question of legacy was answered. His niece Rachel's daughter spoke on behalf of the American family. Uncle Buck never talked much about the war, she said. But every January 18th, he would eat chocolate at dawn. And every night he would line up 3 wooden dolls on the mantle. We did not understand why until a letter came from Japan in 1952. Then we understood. He had chosen to save lives instead of take them. And that choice echoed across 70 years. The final message came from Kenji, age 78 now, Amiko's son. He had crossed the Pacific a dozen times, built a life that bridged 2 cultures, 2 former enemies now bound by gratitude. My mother taught me that mercy is not weakness, Kenji said. It is strength, because mercy requires courage. It requires seeing humanity when propaganda tells you to see monsters. Buck Morrison had that courage. And because he did, 91 of us stand here today. He paused, looked at the bronze statue, the soldier and child frozen in an act of kindness. We are told to remember the battles, the victories, the territories won, but I ask you to remember this instead. 1 chocolate bar, 1 choice, 91 lives, proof that mercy multiplies, proof that kindness never dies. The crowd was silent. Then slowly someone began to clap. Then another. Then everyone. 91 descendants, Japanese officials, American veterans who had flown over for the ceremony, all clapping for a Texas cowboy who had taught them that the bravest thing a soldier can do is share his last chocolate bar. If you believe this story deserves to be remembered, share this video. If you know a veteran who chose mercy over violence, tag them below. Their stories matter, because Buck Morrison showed us that the true measure of a life is not how many enemies you defeated, but how many lives you saved. Now let me tell you what happened to those 91 descendants, because the story does not end in 2015. Amiko's great-grandson became a diplomat at the United Nations, negotiates peace treaties. Every negotiation, he carries a small piece of Hershey's chocolate in his pocket. Reminder of where mercy leads. Haruka's granddaughter runs a PTSD clinic in Tokyo, treats veterans from multiple countries, American, Japanese, Korean. The clinic logo is a chocolate bar. Patients understand immediately. Yuki's great-great-granddaughter, Chocoreto, is learning English, age 5. Already she knows the story. Already she understands that her existence is proof that kindness multiplies. Aiko's family still farms, but now they donate 20% of their harvest to refugee organizations. Syrian families displaced by war, African communities fleeing violence, mercy recognizing mercy across cultures and continents. And every January 18th, all 91 descendants gather, sometimes in Hiroshima, sometimes in Tokyo, sometimes smaller groups in different cities. But all of them eat Hershey's chocolate. All of them tell the story to their children. All of them remember the guardian angel who looked like a Texas cowboy. They asked Buck Morrison once if he won the war. This was 1976. The documentary filming, the question direct. I did not win the war, Buck said. His voice was tired. Honest. I just helped 12 people survive it. Maybe that is the only war worth winning. The battle against hatred in your own heart. The interviewer pressed. But you saved 91 lives across 4 generations. Surely that is victory. Buck looked at the camera, directly at whoever would be watching decades later. Looked at you right now hearing this story. Victory is not the right word, he said. I made a choice. One choice, to see humans instead of enemies. Everything else just multiplied from there. That is not special. That is just basic human decency. The question is not why I did it. The question is why it was so rare. That question hung in the air, unanswered, maybe unanswerable. But here is what we know. One Hershey's chocolate bar, one Texas cowboy, one choice to see humans instead of enemies. 70 years later, 91 Levs across 4 generations still gather every January 18th to prove that mercy never dies. It multiplies. What would you do if you had 30 seconds to choose between following orders or following your conscience? What would you do if the enemy had a face and a name and a family? Buck Morrison showed us the answer. You choose mercy. You choose to see the human. You choose chocolate over cruelty. And 70 years later, 91 people gathered to prove you were right. This is the story of the chocolate protocol. This is the story of when America chose its best self. This is the story of how one choice multiplied across 4 generations and proved that kindness is stronger than war. The final image, the Morrison Ranch in Texas, present day. Buck's niece still owns it. The mantle still holds the display. 15 wooden dolls arranged in a careful circle. The teacher, the nurse, the farmer, the bride, all 12 women. Buck's 3, complete. In front of them, a fresh Hershey's bar, placed there every January 18th by family who remembers, by descendants who understand. And a photograph. Buck Morrison, age 24, Philippine jungle, 1945, muddy, bearded, but smiling, really smiling. Because in that moment, someone had captured him, not as a soldier, but as a guardian. Next to it, another photograph. Fukuoka School, 1952. Buck surrounded by 12 women and 23 children, all of them eating chocolate, all of them alive. In a final photograph. Hiroshima Memorial, 2015. 91 descendants holding Hershey's bars toward the sky. A toast to mercy, a celebration of multiplication. Text appears on screen. In memory of Private James Morrison, 1921 to 1982, and the 12 women he taught us to see as human, Emiko Haruka, Yuki Aiko, Setsuko Fumiko Chio, and 5 others whose names are written in heaven. May we all choose chocolate over cruelty. The screen fades to black. But the story does not end, because somewhere right now, 91 descendants are living their lives, teaching their children, sharing chocolate on January 18th, telling the story of the guardian angel who looked like a Texas cowboy. And the mercy he chose is still multiplying. 1 chocolate bar, 91 lives. Proof that kindness never dies. It just keeps growing.